review. We haven't been in Esther for quite some time because we had the holidays and all, and then we had a prophecy update, and then I was out of town, and so we haven't been here for a while. So there is a king, his name is Hazaris, and in his kingdom, the Medo-Persian Empire, there are Jews that have been exiled out of their country that didn't go back into their country. So they're living in the culture. And they've actually become integrated into the culture, so much so that they weren't going to go back to Jerusalem. So we're not hearing the story about them back in Jerusalem. These are the Jews spread abroad. Now, King Ahasuerus was at his summer palace in Shushan one evening, one season, and he was having a drinking party with his buddies, and as he was prone to do, and he called his wife the queen. Now, he had concubines as well. He lived as a pagan king, and he had a harem, as it were, but he had one wife that was in the position of queen. She was like the vice president, as it were, the first lady, but she was chosen to be the queen, and she was honorable, and her name was Vashti, but he was drunk, and he wanted to show off her beauty and parade her beauty, which is actually illegal for her to do, to show off sexually in front of men, and she refused to do so. She was noble in that act, and he puts her away. She's no longer the queen. And so now he has nobody in that official position. But what he does after that is he goes off to war with the Greeks. Now, this is in the waning years of the Persian Empire. They're losing their power, they're losing their authority. But who comes after the Persian Empire? Are the Greeks. And the Greeks are hungry. They're disciplined. They're ready to rock and roll. Ahasuerus' father had been defeated. He wanted to redeem himself against his father's defeaters, and so he went against them during this time, and he lost. And he failed, and he comes back with his tail between his legs, and so his advisors say, you need a queen. You need it to look normal. You're looking like a failure. You need to put everything in order, and so you need to have a beauty contest, and you need to choose a queen to fulfill that role. And lo and behold, the young Jewish girl named Esther is the one that wins that particular beauty contest and is made queen. Now, she's noble in many ways. She was raised by her older cousin, and he was a very noble man, as we've seen through the stories up to this point. And so she was an orphan, but she was raised by her godly older cousin, and his name was Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, even as his charge, as it were, his adopted daughter, becomes queen, he doesn't use that. He just works hard. He works his way into the government in this place called Shushan, this summer palace for the king of Persia. And he's sitting in the gates, and he hears people discussing how they want to kill the king, and they're making plans to kill Ahasuerus. And Mordecai gets wind of it, he reports it, and these men are found out to be plotting against his life. And Mordecai is the one that reveals it to the king. Now, interestingly enough, Mordecai, in the immediate, isn't rewarded for this. It's just kind of brushed over. It's written down, it's recorded, but it's brushed over. But that was the Lord's plan. Now, what ends up happening later is this king is manipulated into allowing a certain man to have great power, to come into the level of prime minister, as it were, below the president, the second in command of the kingdom. And this man is a small man in his personality. Why? Because he's trying to force people to worship him, to bow down before him every time he walks by. The problem is, he walks by the city gates where the civic servants would work, and Mordecai's there, but he's Jewish. He's not going to bow down to any mere man. And he probably knows a lot about this man in particular. Now, it is interesting that this man is actually a descendant of Agag, King Agag, an Amalekite, the gift that keeps on giving, right? They just historically just kept on coming after the Jews. They were supposed to be wiped out. The Jews didn't obey, and they keep on coming back after the Jews. They come up again and again and again, right? So this man, Haman, this Agate, this Amalekite, is now second in command, and Mordecai won't bow down before him. So Haman knows that Mordecai is Jewish. He doesn't know Esther's Jewish. He doesn't know they're related. But he hates Mordecai. And so he gets so upset, he manipulates the king once again to create a law, whereas in a few months, actually it's almost a year later, the Jews were to be killed in the whole kingdom. Now understand, the Medo-Persian Empire covered probably 100 different languages and cultures. It was one of the world empires that was mentioned in Daniel. So the world empires at that time were Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire we're looking at, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. Okay, and so it was one of those great four empires. And so throughout all the land, this law was sent out at a certain time. This group of people were to be put to death, and all their possessions were to be taken and given to Haman. And so this was law. He manipulated the king into putting it into law. The king had no idea what he was doing. He didn't check it out. He allowed himself to be manipulated. He wasn't a good leader in that way. So he wanted to have all the Jews wiped out. Now, again, the king didn't know that his queen was Jewish either. And he really is like, oh, these people, whatever, just do what you want, Haman. I'll do you a favor. You're my new right-hand man. Now, when Mordecai found out about Haman's death decree, his plan to kill all the Jews, he asked Esther to interfere. And this is where we get the most famous passage out of the book of Esther, or the story of Esther. In Esther 4:14, it tells us, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, Esther, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Right? For such a time as this. And again, that's very important for us today, because we are God's people. We're in touch with God. We're listening to God. We're following God's principles. We have God's promises. We have God's future. We have his salvation. We have this. For God so loved the world, the whole world, everyone in the world, made in his image for his good pleasure. And he has the desires that none should perish and all should come to salvation. And for such a time as this, we live in such a place as this, and we have such a message as this, and he chose us to be alive for such a time as this. And if you look around, we're just a ragtag fugitive fleet of people, right? That's from Battlestar Galactica, if you guys don't recognize it. But anyways, it's just a ragtag of group of people kind of traveling through this space and time. And we're at the end of the road. We're in Corpus Christi, and here we are. But you know what? For such a time as this, we are the people that God has chosen to live in this time. I could have lived at any other time in history, but God has chosen for such a time as this that we live in this country. And he has called us. And so I love that phrase, for such a time as this. I used to have it written on the back wall up by our clock there. But there was a problem for Esther, because it wasn't, oh, king, and she'd go in there and start nagging the king. It didn't work like that. She wasn't able just to walk up to him. You see, he did have a harem. At this point in time, Esther hadn't seen the king or been called to his chambers to be with him for about 30 days. I don't know if she was falling out of favor, if he was in a depression. I don't know what in the world's going on with him. But she hadn't seen him. And the king was almost absolutely sovereign. And so you had to be asked to come in. You weren't allowed to bust in the doors. Now, I find that interesting. Earthly kings would do this, and it was a common thing. You had to go through all kinds of channels to get an audience with the king. If you approached him without an arranged audience or without him asking for you to come in, you could be put to death. Now, what does the Lord tell us? He says, come boldly before the throne of grace. You are the apple of my eye. He calls us his children. And so he loves us, and he's a much greater king than any other king that has ever ruled, right? And he invites us in. But kings would do this, and I think it's a way of flexing their power and showing their might. Now, if you came into the king's presence and he pointed his scepter or his symbol of power towards you, you would be able to live, or else he could give you the death sentence immediately. And so Esther decided, yes, she will do this, right? And so she did approach the king, and she said this: if I perish, I perish. Right? If I perish, I perish. Either way, I'm going to perish, right? Because I am Jewish. And the fact of the matter is, the king could put me to death. Now, what did she do? Well, when she went in and she was given permission to speak, the king said, whatever you want. And first thing she does is she invites the king and his right-hand man, who she knows, Haman, this bad dude, right, to a private banquet. And at the banquet, instead of bringing up the problem, the king promises her again, whatever you want, Esther, what is it? And she doesn't ask for her people to be saved at that point in time. She simply asks for them to show up at another banquet. And so it's banquet and it's banquet, it's promises, and the tension's building. And we looked at this, and there's God's timing. So often we go in like bowls in a china shop when God has a timing for us, right? And so Haman is sitting there going, well, I keep on getting invited to the queen's parties. And it seems like that's one of the official roles that the queen had, was to throw parties and to give a good look. So he's excited about this second banquet. He's bragging to his family how the queen keeps on asking him to these parties and everything. And so he's very prideful, right? And even after this first banquet where he's invited to the second banquet, he actually goes home and he starts talking about Haman. Because he's on the top of the world, then he sees Haman, it's like he's bummed out. He wants to kill him. And so he has a gallows built. And a gallows was a stick that would stick up high in the air that they would impale people on if they wanted to kill them, as an example of people to don't mess with the king, don't mess with authority, don't mess with the government, right? And so he had this built so he could kill Mordecai, Esther's cousin, Esther's adoptive father. And so he has this, and he's very upset. Now that same night, so he's very upset at Mordecai, and he wants to have him killed, even though he's going to be going to the banquet the next day. Now that same night, providentially, what does God do? God shows up and keeps the king awake. And God providentially makes sure that he gets something really boring to read, a history book. And he's reading this history book about his history, recent history, and in this history book, he's reminded that this guy Mordecai had actually saved his life. And he asks, what did we do for this guy Mordecai? And they said, well, we didn't reward him. So the next day, he actually asks Haman, what should I do for a man that I want to honor? And Haman gets all excited, right? He gets all excited about that. And he tells him all these things that he would like to happen to him. And he says, go out and do that for Mordecai. And I just love that, right? He steps into his own trap. And he is just so upset. But he still has to go to the second banquet. Now, at the second banquet, Esther reveals that she and her people are under a death threat by the very man that is sitting there with them, by Haman, that he wants to put them to death, including Mordecai, a hero. And so he's just caught up. So at this point in time, though, that's where we are now. At this point in time, Haman is put to death, but there is still a law that is out there. And the law says at this certain date, I think it's 9 or 10 months out at this point in time, all the Jews are to be killed all over the kingdom by the locals, and all their stuff collected and brought to the king. Okay? Now that law is out there. The king can't just cancel his law. So now there is a problem. And so the question is, Esther's life, quote unquote, was saved, maybe, and her people, it was revealed, but are they saved? Are they safe? No, the law is still out there. And he's not allowed to change laws. He's allowed to make laws, but he's not allowed to change laws. And so the king has a dilemma on his hands. He's made a law that he can't change. So he's going to have to figure out a new law to deal with the other law, right? Now, why is this so? Why couldn't he just change the law? Well, as you look into Daniel chapter 2, the king has this dream. He wants his magicians or his wise men to interpret the dream. And he throws a catch in there. He says, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You have to tell me what the dream is and then tell me the interpretation. And so these guys are about to die. Daniel steps in. He's their hero. God gives them the dream and then gives them the interpretation of the dream. And in this dream, what happens is there are 4 world kingdoms, the history of world kingdoms. Now, there had been so-called world kingdoms before this, or large kingdoms. But from that point on, there's 4 kingdoms laid out until the very end, until the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And this is what was in his vision. And in Daniel 2:37, it says, you, O king, are king of kings. This is the previous kingdom. This is the Babylonian kingdom. Who wiped out the Babylonians? The Medo-Persians, right? So he's speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. He says, you, O king, are king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand. He has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. So he had this vision of a statue with a head of gold, arms and chests of silver, a torso of bronze, and then legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And so these represent lowering levels of what we would call in science specific gravity, denseness of the metal, as it were. Not strength, because gold is malleable, but the head was gold, and that represented the Babylonians or King Nebuchadnezzar himself. And then with the 2 arms, it's the Medo-Persian Empire. We hear about Darius the Mede in Daniel. This is Hazaris, the Persian king. So the Medo-Persian Empire had 2 arms, but it was silver. The torso was bronze, and the legs were iron. And so it goes from less and less precious metal, okay? So what he's basically saying is you are absolutely sovereign. The word sovereign means free. Means free. The one at the top of the food chain is the one that is the most free and has the most choices. So our God is sovereign. He is absolutely free to make whatever choice he wants to make. No one's going to tell God no. Okay? So this is what King Nebuchadnezzar represented in the world kingdoms. So he could make a law and change a law, right? But then you get down to the Medo-Persian Empire. They would make a law, but they had to keep that law. Because remember Darius, when Darius put Daniel in the lion's den, he's like, oh no, I can't stop it. He was manipulated into making a law, but he couldn't back off the law. And so the same problem is happening in this story. He's made a law and he can't change the law, right? And so he's bound by his own laws. Now you get into the bronze and you're talking about the Greek Empire, and they're more accountable to the people and have less sovereignty. And then you get into the Roman Empire, and they actually have parliaments and things like that, where there's less sovereignty, freedom for the leadership, right? And in America, our rulers, quote unquote rulers, are to answer to the people, right? So there's less sovereignty for our public officials. As it is written, as most people that were taught correct history understand it. Once they get there, they kind of don't believe it, right? Anyways, so at the end of chapter 7, we see Haman hanged on his own gallows, which were intended for his enemy. And that's such a catch-22, right? He just turns right on him. Now we're at verse 1 in chapter 8. So it says, on that day, King Hazaris gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So he goes from prime target to prime minister, right? He's under the death sentence, and now he is second in command in the kingdom. He's given Haman's household. He's given everything that Haman owns, including his position. How awesome is that? The only thing that could have made the story better is if Haman was killed after that happened, right? Because he didn't get to see that. He was already dead, right? And he's made the prime minister of Persia. You know what Persia is today? I don't know if you ever run into anybody from Iran, but you'll ask them, are you from Iraq? They go, no, I'm Persian, right? Because Persian sounds better than Iranian, And so they're Persians. They're not Arabs, they are Persians. They're a different group of people. But could you imagine a Jew in second in command in Iran today? I couldn't imagine it. But back then it actually happened. The Lord was on their side. They'd become a part of the culture. So the queen and the prime minister in Persia at that time were Jews. Now, up to this time, the king didn't know that Mordecai was the adopted father over Esther. Now, I think this shows some more integrity for Mordecai. Every time I go through this story, I see a few more things, but one of the things is he didn't take advantage of that, right? If we know someone famous, we drop names, don't we? He never did that. He just worked hard. He let her do her thing, but he was going to just be what he was, what God made him. He left his promotion up to God, same thing that we should do. And he didn't try to capitalize it. Now, it is interesting, though, we see the king of Persia drop authority on a guy that's bad, and now he's dropping authority on someone that's good. Now, if you're in any role of authority, you have the ability to give authority away. In fact, you should give it away, right, in order to function in a greater fashion in whatever type of situation you're in. And so if you're in a home, you give each other authority over certain things in the home, given your temperament, right, given what you're able to do or your talents in the home, right? Certain things that my wife is definitely better at than the home, and she has more authority over those types of things. Now, push comes to shove, I'm still her husband. She respects me and everything. But she has great authority over many things because she's better than me, and it works. It functions a lot better. In the church, I wasn't at church today. Why? I was at home studying. And I'm teaching tonight and tomorrow night and then Sunday. And so, I end up studying a lot. Sometimes I stay at home when I study. And the church runs fine. In fact, it might run better when I'm not here, because coming in as a pastor teacher, I have to or as a church planter, you have to give away authority, right? And out of fear, sometimes people don't give away any authority, or out of foolishness, they give away too much authority and they give it away to wrong people. Now, everybody makes mistakes, right? You can make mistakes in the way that you give out authority, but it's real important for us, especially as Christians, to pray and look for biblical principles. In our church, we try, and we've made mistakes over the years, but we try to give authority as per 1 Timothy chapter 3, Acts chapter 6, Titus chapter 1. There's these places where the authority should be given to certain people in certain ways. And again, it's really interesting because you think, well, what's the big deal about this? I understand that some people aren't good at authority, or some people that have problems with authority figures in the past. Or you assume everybody knows how to wield authority, and sometimes people abuse authority and they don't know they're even doing it, right? And so this is a big deal. But I just want you to know that it's something that you probably should think about in your life, and look at biblical principles on handing out and giving away authority and also receiving authority. What do you do with it? Right? Are you usurping authority? Are you ruling over with an iron fist? Are you like a Saul in the Bible, throwing spears? One of the books that we went through in our book club was called The Tale of Three Kings. You had a guy usurping authority, and that was David's son Absalom. And then you have a guy wielding authority with a spear from the top, my way or the highway, and I'm going to kill you. And that was Saul. And then you had someone somewhere in the middle, David, right? And David was always trying not to be a Saul, but also not to usurp people's authority either, But there's many questions with that. But I've discovered too late at times that people do have problems with authority, or various different reasons for that, their history and abuse in the past or whatever it is. And so we see kind of Hazaris just kind of throwing out authority there quickly. And the thing is, if you give authority to someone wrongly, it's always going to bite you. It's going to come back at you. So anyways, he gains second. He's established as a second in authority in this kingdom. Now Esther spoke, verse 3, again to the king and fell down at his feet and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman, the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out his golden scepter towards Esther. So she approaches him the second time with this plea. Now he had invited her, but he still had that authority over her life, and he holds out the scepter. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see this evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? So Esther pleads for her and her brethren's lives. She again puts her life on the line. This isn't comfortable. We talked about this before, but it's not comfortable for Esther to be doing this. Esther could have hidden her identity, pulled herself back, and just let it happen around her. She could have just let people be destroyed. The problem is she has a conscience. I believe she has a relationship with God, at least, somewhat through her uncle bringing her conscience to bear. But the Lord gives her strength, and she's able to do with her authority a good thing. Instead of just serving herself, she uses her authority, she uses her position for a good thing. I love it when strong Christians are promoted. I love it when they get a greater place in their job or their rank increases. Why? They're going to weld it. They're going to weld their authority for good, for eternal good, instead of just for themselves, just for the pay raise or whatever they might be gaining. Sometimes I think that we as the rich American church can fall into the comfort zone and not worry about anyone but ourselves. And I love missions. I was at a missions conference last week, and I was talking to a man for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and Cambrielle and I got in this deep conversation with this guy, and his church is smaller than ours, and he has 100 missionaries out on the field in his little church. And he's looking at me going, there's still, I don't know what the number was, this amount of people that don't even have access to hear the name of Jesus on the earth today. And he says, that breaks my heart. And I'm going to do everything I can to solve that problem. Right? And he's like, comfort zone, nothing. He blows out his budget all the time to try to reach these people. He goes for it. And it's amazing. He's actually my niece's pastor. And it was just such a blessing to hear that passion. But I often wonder, why did God bless the American church so much? for us to build mega complexes and massive buildings with state-of-the-art facilities? I often ask, is that why God blessed the church in America? So we can just do this and just be comfortable and having banquets and, free Starbucks coffee, whatever, whatever it is that's out there. Every bell and whistle you can ever imagine. And there's people out there that haven't even heard the gospel. My wife and I, we give to the church, but we also give to missionaries above and beyond what we give to the church. It's just a part of our mentality. And the Lord challenges us on this. He challenges us. Try to outgive me. He's willing to be tested in that one area. Try to outgive me. Do it with the right heart. Don't use it as like a stock investment or something. But it's an eternal investment. It actually reaps better rewards than the stock market ever could. Because it reaps eternal rewards that you're not going to leave behind. Right? And so we do need a burden. So Esther goes in and she gets out of her comfort zone. She might lose her life, and she pleads on behalf of people's lives. And these people are under condemnation. And there's a time restraint. Listen. The world is under condemnation. Jesus Christ didn't come into the world to condemn the world. John chapter 3 tells us the world already is condemned. He came to save the world out of their condemnation, didn't he? They're already going there. He came to save them. For God so loved the world that he gave. If he didn't give, the world would just be going to hell in a handbasket, right? And so she puts herself out there, out of her comfort zone, condemn people. And I think for us, more and more, the timeline of God is becoming more and more of an imperative. They had about 8 to 9 months left to get the message all over the place to fix the problem. And they're under a timeline. They're under a crunch. This world is under a crunch. I don't know how much longer the Lord's going to hold back his hand. Because he is a just God, and justice eventually has to come. How long is he going to hold back his hand? People scoff. But the Lord's long-suffering is for a purpose, because he still loves the people that are going to end up being judged. But he also gave us a timeline. And that timeline is a ticking, right? And so as I see this, it's like, okay, there's a timeline for a condemned people. What are we going to do about it? A Christian lawyer, there are some out there, for Youth for Christ. He was at a prayer meeting and he prayed, Lord, the only thing most of us know about sacrifice is how to spell the word. Right? Like, do we sacrifice? Do we surrender? Do we go for it? Do we let it hurt every once in a while in our outreach, or our giving up of a Saturday, or even a holiday, or inviting people into our home during a holiday, or going and feeding people, or whatever it might be? We need to get out of that comfort zone, right? And be willing. Just be willing, and God will open the doors. You don't have to force yourself out of it. Just be willing, and God will open those doors. He loves to show us what he wants to do. You know who gets to see God work the most? The servants. Right? Who got to see the water turn to wine? The partiers or the servants? Servants did, right? So she put it all into line for a condemned people. Verse 7, then King Hazaris said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. No one can revoke it. So he says, we need a new plan. And he looks at Mordecai and he goes, you fix it. He's his right-hand man, right? Makes sense. He has the most to lose as well. So often people come up to me, oh, our last church, we did this, and it's so awesome. I go, yeah, it's a great idea, so why don't you do that? And they're like, well, no, you're supposed to do it. And I'm like, no, you have the passion for it. I'm already doing everything out of the passion for it. My plate's full. No, you care about it. You have the vision. You need to go for it, right? So often that happens. So this is actually a good choice because he cared about the issue the most, right? So again, you can't take away the first law, but you can provide a counteracting law, right? So we have laws like the law of gravity. So if you take a big metal tube and you take it up in the sky and you drop it, what's going to happen to that big metal tube? And what if you fill that big metal tube full of people and you drop it? There's the law of gravity, right? So what do? We counteract the law of gravity with the law of aerodynamics and stick wings on that big metal tube. Right? And so you're counteracting a force with another force. This law has to be counteracted with another law. How are they going to get out of it with a new law? Right? And so there's all kinds of counteracting plans in the world. This is how we function, right? But there's counteractive things in the scriptures, right? Because we have all these bad things that want to destroy us. And what does God say about those bad things in Romans 8:28? I'm going to still take those bad things and I'm going to work them for your good. Right? And that's what he does. All things work together for the good for those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. So God has a plan even in that. We may not see it this side of heaven, but on that side of heaven, we will see the results of whatever happened here. And the purpose is to change us into the character of Christ, as the next verse. So that's a counteracting force against the bad things that happen. God's going to use them for the good for those that love him. The law of grace counteracts the law of judgment, right? Isn't that a good one, the law of grace? Because we all sit under the judgment without grace, right? The law of the Spirit over the law of the flesh. And so there are counteracting laws as well in the Bible. And so they're going to have to come up with a law. Verse 9, so the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, to the Jews in their own script and language. And so it's going to be distributed. Now, side note, Bible trivia, the longest verse in the Bible, right here, verse 9 in Esther chapter 8. Okay, Esther chapter 8, verse 10, it says, and he wrote in the name of King Hazaris and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children, women, to plunder their possessions. So he's writing it in the king's name. He gets to write it, and the king signs it. Okay? So the gist is not offense, but self-defense. Before, they were just to be put to death, their stuff plundered, and given back to the king. Now, if they try that, the king has made it clear that they are able to annihilate anybody that tries to touch them. Self-defense, right? But the message was clear. These people are now protected. That previous law is still a law. You can try to kill them, but they have permission to kill you right back. And who knows? It sounds like the king would make another law where you get in trouble if you did that, right? But they can defend themselves. Now, if everybody decided to raise up against them, they still could have died, because there was many more of the native people around them than Jews in these provinces, from India all the way down into Ethiopia. And so they still could have tried. But listen, God had given them promises. God's people have always been a minority, yet one plus God is a majority. Right? God's on their side. He'd given them so many promises. Obey me, you'll be protected. What did they do? They ran to the Egyptians. They tried to make deals amongst the Moabites, different people throughout time. They didn't trust God. The Bible would look so different if the Jews just trusted God from the beginning, right? But they didn't do that. J. Vernon McGee. Now, if you want to say it like Jay would, but the Jew has attended the funeral of every one of the nations that has tried to exterminate him. That's radical, isn't it? But it is true. You know what? That's also true of the church. You realize that, right? We have promises as a church. The gates of hell will not prevail against us. And so they're to work as a team and protect themselves. A man named Thomas Carlyle said, 10 men band together in love and unity can do what 10,000 separately would fail to do. What's he saying? Teamwork is so important. Teamwork is awesome. I think in our church we really felt that when we did the Christmas outreach this year. So many people were involved. It was like, yeah, and it was just a blast. We accomplished a lot in a little amount of time, and it was just awesome. The question is, are you afraid of one grasshopper, i.e. a locust? But what about 1 million of them banded together? What do? Create famine, destroy lives. They eat houses, man. It's crazy, right? Esther 8, verse 12. On one day in all the provinces of King Hazaris, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out and hastened, pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. And so about 70 days since the death decree went upon them and their ability to defend themselves was declared, it ends up they have now about 8 months to get ready. But again, the people got the message. The king didn't want the Jews to be harmed. And again, you see a pagan king protecting the nation of Israel. How many times have we seen that to this point in the Bible? I mean, we've seen it so many times that God can use anybody to do his work. And their message meant life or death. And it was a very serious thing, but it's also a very serious thing for us, because the message that we hold in our hearts means life and death for people. Verse 15, so Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Why? He's a righteous man, and they knew it. At least that city's going to be blessed. He's going to protect them from some of the foolish decisions of Hazaris. And in every province and city, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and city where the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness and a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews, fear in this way of respect of the Jews, fell upon them. So the chapter begins with Queen Esther in tears before the king, but it ends with the Jews rejoicing and feasting. Billy Sunday said this: if you have no contentment or joy in your religion, there is a leak in your Christianity somewhere. Where do I find most joy? When I'm most committed. When I'm most absorbed into it. I talk to people all the time, and people will come to me, what happened to my marriage? And I'll tell them, I go, you've been backsliding for about 5 years, or 7 years, or 9 years. You haven't been committed. You haven't gotten your tails into church or been too committed at getting together with others, like-minded people, and letting iron sharpen iron, and spurring one another on towards love and good deeds. And where'd your morning devotions go? Where'd your family worship go? Where'd the prayer walks with your spouse go? Where'd serving together go? Where did just the spontaneous conversations about God and your love for God and him speaking to your heart, where did those things go? Yeah, oh, you got busy. Well, you also are able to set your own priorities. And you saw this coming from a mile away. What'd you do about it, And that isn't always the case, but it's often the case. It's often the case that we let things go. And people, well, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, you know what? I do wrong things in my marriage all the time. If I do a series of wrong things, I can destroy the marriage. Got to catch yourself. Got to maintain. Had a conversation with someone on the phone the other day, and I had two young men that had been married less than 2 years, and I looked at them and I said, maintenance. One of them was my son-in-law. One of them was like my son-in-law. And I looked at these guys, just maintain your marriage, man. Stay on top of it. Just effort. Work on it. I'm just looking at these young guys sitting in my living room, and I just got off a horrible phone call. Maintenance. Why my wife and I still married today? Because we repent of our stupidity often and get back to center and center on Jesus again. Will we waver? We'll waver again, and we got to repent, and we got to get back to center. And there's some incredible people out there that are spectacular good people that might get along without that. But I'm telling you, Chuck Smith with his wife had to do that. I'm telling you, every pastor that has a good marriage that you look up to, they have to do that. Every marriage around you that you see, 99.99% of them have to get back to center, have to focus back on Jesus, have to put effort into the relationship, and have to maintain it. Without it, absolute destruction, right? And so, what happened? You left the spout where the blessings come out. You wandered off and you thought it would be okay. But it's not okay out there. You want to be under the spout where the blessings come out. And you know where that is? Smack dab in the center of obedience to God and his clear admonitions in the scriptures, right? That's where the blessings are. Would more people be attracted to Christianity and consider the message of the gospel if Christians manifested their joy more, their confidence more, their fulfillment in the Lord more? I think they would, right? I think they would. Again, with the events of the last week, I think we know that we've got to be Christians before we're of this party or of that party, right? Again, I'm not going to stop approaching politicians. And my modus operandi is I don't care what letter's after your name. You need Jesus, right? I tend to agree with policies on one side over another, but my hope is not in those policies. Those policies are temporary. What are those policies going to mean in 1,000,000 years? Those souls need to be saved. What do they mean in 1,000,000 years? Everything, right? And so we've got to be recentered on the right thing. So what expression have you been showing to those around you? Now, it doesn't mean that you fake. It doesn't mean that you fake Christianity. But when you're hurting, you hurt well, not hurt well, you hurt acknowledging God, right? That you I call it white knuckling. You're holding on to God with white knuckles. And sometimes that's what it feels like, doesn't it? And you're just like, oh. And I always tell people, when you go through a trial, it doesn't feel like you're close to God. But what is faith? Hope in future things that you don't see, right? And so if you're not feeling it, you're showing greater faith when you're not feeling it. That's where faith becomes real and becomes strong when you're not feeling it. If you're feeling it and you're on a high, well, you're just riding a high, man. It's all good. Everybody could walk with God like that. Remember Shadrach, and Meshach, and Abednego? They said, even if not, Lord, or even if not, Nebi, we're okay. We're good. I'm going to be okay. And my whole thing with COVID, if COVID takes me, I'm good. You suckers are left behind. No, just kidding. I don't have a death wish, but I don't function out of fear. I function out of wisdom, right? And so we have this confidence, like cold water to a weary soul, so is good news from a distant land. Do the people around you need good news? They do, right? And the good news is they can have a relationship with God. What are they trusting in? Most are trusting in politics or circumstance and a hope of a better world. The more technology, the more advanced we get, the worse we get. Because it's the same old sin manifested in a broader way, isn't it? It's the same old sin, right? It's lust, it's anger, it's greed, it's pettiness. And now we have Facebook to be petty. Man, it'd probably be good for gossip if all Christians got kicked off Facebook. We wouldn't be able to gossip as much, right? We'd get along better. Anyways. So people became Jews. And maybe not full-on proselytes, because they were supposed to go back to the temple and do certain ceremonies and sacrifices, but at least God-fearers. And so God's doing a good thing from a bad thing. How cool is that? From prime target to prime power. Now the Jews have this incredible authority to witness about their God. Now, I don't think they did a great job with it. Some seem to have. We always run into these God-fearers, don't we? And somehow they got there. It was events like this that made them come to that place. But what would happen if they were persistent and consistent with that message while they had the floor? What happens? Well, we need to stay the course. The question is now today, do we give up our principles today to appease the world, or do we stay the course? But the thing is, if we give up our principle, the salt has lost its saltiness. There's no effect if we become like the world and try to convert the world to be like themselves, right? So we don't give up our principles to be accepted by the world. Because in public, man, they're going to come against us more and more and more. But in private, you're going to run into those that are really confused and searching and looking. And God has given us his eternal principles, not his temporary principles. Some people say, well, don't talk about sin. People don't like to know they're sinners. Don't talk about something gory like a sacrifice, blood. All the blood. This is my body which is broken for you. No. We got to talk about that. That's man's biggest problem. And their biggest healing comes in the truth, right? Yeah, we can be very creative and very loving, hopefully, when we're sharing that with them. But we need to talk about the things that are essential. People say, oh, don't get too fanatical. You're turning people away. Don't get too committed. Oh, it's just a phase. Some of you have heard that. But can you be too committed to God? Now, you can be really weird and blame it on God. A lot of Christians do that. But I've yet to see a man that was too committed to God. You think if you ask Paul, are you too committed? What's Paul's answer? He gave it to us. He says, I strain forward, I stretch, I sweat, I reach out for the upward call, right? He did not stop. He just kept on going. And he wouldn't say, I've arrived, because he told us, I haven't arrived. He was still reaching. He was still trying to be deeper in his commitment to God. Paul, beat that one, right? Show your joy, show your peace, show your hope and be willing to suffer in front of people. Because in this world you will face trial and tribulation, right? We're not immune to that. This isn't heaven. Now, this was a happy ending. It's not always happy endings, is it? Right? It's not always riding off into the sunset. Not all faithful Christians are promoted or given special honors this side of heaven. Some will even get fired for walking with God and sharing God with people. We're not promised promotion, health, and wealth, at least physically here on earth. But he has promised us that he is still in control. He's in charge of all the circumstances. But the thing is, he writes the last chapter of our book. Each one of us is a book of Acts, and he knows what the ending is for us, and he promises us that it's good. And it ends up somewhere described in the end of the book of Revelation. If he doesn't promote us here, he certainly will give us the glory there. Vance Havner had a wife that he loved, and I think good Christians love their wives, right? He was asked the question, why didn't you get the answer you wanted? And the question, or the issue was the healing of his wife. And he said, it was so I might minister to the multitude of those who didn't receive the answers either, that I might be a comrade of those in the valley. I tell people, one of the greatest things that shaped me was the death of my own son. And it's not like, oh, goody, goody, but it's a promise from God that he was going to transform my wife and I. I mean, I buried my parents, I buried my wife's parents, but it's natural to bury your parents. It's still painful. But when a child dies, it's like, no, that's not natural, right? And I grew more from that. And I'm going to see my child again. I have that promise, and so that hope is there, but it still hurt really bad. You know, when you get a pointer, you fall, or you hit your elbow, you get a zinger or whatever, and you're trying to get rid of that pain. Ours lasted like that for about 5 years. But we grew through it, and we're better people for it. And we understand pain a lot more. We don't just, pray for you, brother. We kind of go, ooh, ouch. And we hurt with people. And God did an incredible thing in our life. Again, it's not goody-goody, but it's God. And he works all things for the good, for those that love God, who are the called according to his purpose, to shape us more into his image. And, you know, so for us, it's going through the crisis and allowing people in to see how we go through the crisis. Judy Anderson, her husband, was the West African director of the World Relief Corporation. And she grew up as the daughter of missionaries in Zaire. As a little girl, she went to a day-long rally celebrating the 100th anniversary of Christian missionaries coming to that part of Zaire. After a full day of long speeches and music, an old man came before the crowd and insisted that he be allowed to speak. He said he would soon die, and that he alone had some important information. He said if he did not speak, that information would go with him to the grave. He explained that when Christian missionaries came 100 years prior, his people thought the missionaries were strange and their message unusual. The tribal leaders decided to test the missionaries by slowly poisoning them to death. Over a period of months and years, the missionary children and the missionaries died one by one. Then the old man said, it was as we watched how they died that we decided we wanted to live as Christians. So it's not only how you rejoice, it's also how you struggle. God is always worth worshiping. Again, I've been in leadership for 33 or 34 years. It just keeps on getting longer. And I can say I've had the privilege of being invited to bedsides where people are dying. And I tell them it is an honor to be there. Because when someone loves the Lord, it's just incredible to be with them. And you know what? It's not always pretty. I've seen the death gasp many times. There's a woman that used to sit right back where Shanice was. She was a cancer nurse for 28 years before she was diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer. She had a year to live. First time I went to visit her, she looked fine and healthy, and she's going, I know what's coming, Pastor. So I'm going to be in church as much as possible. She goes, no one can hide anything from me. And I tell you what, she was in our church for about 3 years prior to that. And about 10 days before she died, I was invited into the house, and there was a lot of people there, and we read through so many scriptures as she was dying. But the amazing thing is, I was reading out of her Bible, and I was able to look, and she had saved all the notes she had taken. When we had bulletins, she would write on the back of the bulletins on the note section what was important to her after she found out she had cancer. And I tell you what, it was an honor to find out what she thought was important and to see the witness that she was. And for years, we had people showing up, and she had some pretty radical friends and family members, you know, not normal church people, right? She had a huge impact on people's lives, and she was just a nurse. She never signed up for any leadership things in the church, and she just busy. She was a nurse. But man, she had a huge impact because of the way she lived and because of the way she died. God is always worth worshiping. And I don't know what kind of crazy times befall us. But you know what? I'm going to have joy. I don't like what's happening in Washington. I'm going to have joy. You know, I had a Parler account. It's gone. Right? And a couple other of these accounts that I had, they're gone. I'm okay. I'm going to have joy. I know where this is going. I know who wins. I have the promises of God. And you know what? If my little witness can make a difference in just a few people's lives for eternity, man, it's all worth it. It is all worth it. So as we go forward, guys, get deeper into your walk with God. Be more committed, and that joy through the trials, through the depressions, through the ups and the downs and the losses and the gains, he is always worth worshiping. He is. He gives value to everybody and everything. When Hannah was in prison, I'd always tell her, you know what? You live a fuller life than the guards that are surrounding you that are able to walk away without Jesus. And I used to go on days where it wasn't all the visitors, and so I'd watch the guards in their regular routine. And the gossip and the venom and the they were mostly, it was a female prison, and they were very verbal, and they were very outward about what they thought of one another. You know, and I would sit there and just go, wow, you guys are unhappy. As Hannah's leading women that have murdered people in the joy of the Lord. Our God is an amazing God. Don't get ripped off by your circumstances. They will change. One way or another, they're going to change. Don't find hope in those things. Set your hope fully upon the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. Let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, we thank you. Esther is just such a cool book, Lord, because we get to see the happy ending, Lord. We get to see the turning on people. But at the same time, Lord, Esther and Mordecai are not around today, and they're in heaven. They face the trial of sickness and death, Lord. So we know, Lord, that this place, this middle place where we are, earth, is full of joy and it's full of sorrow, but you say you work all things for the good. And may we just know that just up front and clearly, and may we revel in your promises and your joy and the peace that you offer us even now. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Let's